You are listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
We've got James Carafano, who's with the Heritage Foundation. And James, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to have you. It's amazing. I can't recall a time, a very long time, where we've had so many different things going on around us. It seems to be endless, from whether you look in Asia, you look in Europe now with Russia and Ukraine, the Middle East. Now you have Africa, South and Central America. I mean, these are significant issues, but I think if we can go right to Iraq, and you've written about this, and it's so important because we've been involved here for well over a decade. We've committed hundreds of thousands of troops. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we've had approximately around 600,000 troops who have served in Iraq alone over this time period. We've lost too many men and women. We've sacrificed an awful lot there. And what you see now with the rise of ISIS, or IS now, and an assault, an all-out assault really on the government in Baghdad, and the attack on civilians, the Kurds, you name it. There are a lot of moving parts here. It's very fluid. It's an incredibly dangerous and situation, but it seems to me that the administration completely missed the ball and misunderstood what was really going on there.
So, first of all, we ought to just spend a second and say, why do we care? And people have to remember that there was a decade-long war between Iraq and Iran. The United States invaded that country once. We had a military air cap over it for years. We invaded a second time, and then we went through a long and bloody occupation. We didn't do that for fun. We did that for a reason, and the reason is the Middle East is a vitally important part of the world, not just the economy, not just oil, but the world. And we're a world power, and the Middle East falling apart is not in our interest. And Iraq is like a keystone in the middle of the Middle East. So it's a strategically important country. That's why we care. And that's why the president couldn't just walk away from it like he said we could, that we're done here, and we were just kind of hanging out for a while. And we have two vital interests here. One is if Iraq goes to a protracted civil war, that could become a regional war, and who knows where it could end up. And the other thing is there are at least 10,000 foreign fighters there already. It's a huge pipeline going in there. We could wind up with another Afghanistan, just like the one that existed on September 10th, 2001. A lot closer to the United States and a lot closer to the West. So we have two interests that are risk here. So we have a reason to be there, and it strategically is an important place. The question is not how did we wind up where we are, or who shot John, or what's the president do. The question is what do we have to do to move forward to protect our vital national interests, the American people?
Absolutely. So let's make this situation even worse. It's apparent to me that a lot of what's going on in Iraq actually started in Libya. If you trace the breakdown of relations in Libya, the takedown or assassination of Gaddafi, and the movement of weapons and fighters from that region into Syria, the increase in the Syrian civil war, and then the breakdown of the borders between Syria and Iraq and other places, the flow of refugees and fighters, and now you have what formed in northern Iraq moving downward. But I'd add to that, we also have the other opposite end of the spectrum, and that is the influence of Iran on the Maliki government, but also Iranian troops on the ground in Iraq. This is very confusing.
First of all, you made one very important point there, which people shouldn't lose sight of, which is, Iran is not your friend. In this case, the enemy of my enemy is also my enemy. So we talk about ISIS as if that's the only threat, and some people even say, well, the United States and Iran can work together because we both have an interest in Iraq, and we both have an interest in Iraq, like a bank robber and a bank teller both have an interest in a bank. Iran is evil. In many ways, Iran is the greater evil. They're the greatest threat to peace and stability in that part of the world. And we really are facing two existential threats here. One is the Islamic State, the Islamist state in the middle of the Middle East. The other is the expansion of Iranian influence. And American policy should be working to address both, not one or the other.
I agree with you. I think Iran is such a significant threat to, well, let's just look at the balance of power in the Middle East. Iran is a significant threat to the Saudis, to Egypt, I suppose, in a sense, to Turkey, to Jordan, and of course to what should be our best friend and ally, Israel, which I don't know, it may be to you and I, but I'm not sure about this administration. But you yourself even brought up a stable Jordan as a key component to containing the conflict, and I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, so we ought to get. We could sit here, like guys crying in the rain, and we ought to, and complaining about the rain, but we ought to start by saying, what do we do? Okay, so I have an old maxim in war, right? The way to start winning is to first stop losing, right? So the first thing we have to do is stop losing. And if the president said one thing that was correct before he jumped on the plane and went off to his vacation, he said, hey, this isn't going to be over quickly. Although, ironically, the administration has now said, oh, well, we dealt with the humanitarian crisis, so pretty much we're done here. So apparently the president's actually done with Iraq again. But the reality is defeating these guys and pushing back the Iranians is going to protract the thing. But you have to start somewhere. And so there really is four things that we literally have to do. We have to keep Kurdistan in the fight. The Kurdish part of the country is incredibly strategically important. The Kurds are actually willing to fight. They'll fight to protect their homeland. We just have to support them with the ammunition, the arms, and the air support that they need. And we just have to do that. We have to do it robustly, and we have to do it right now. We need a government in Baghdad that's functional and non-sectarian, because you're never going to be able to get the Iraqi military back in the fight unless you've got a legitimate government in Baghdad, and you're never going to be able to keep the country from flying apart. And I know there are a lot of people say, oh, well, let's just do the smart thing and let the country devolve into three pieces. Basically, what you'd have then is basically three pieces of red meat for the vultures to fight over, and it would mean a lot more war, not a lot less. So you've got to keep Kurdistan in the fight. You've got to get to a legitimate government in Baghdad so you can get the Iraqi military back in the fight. You've got to keep Jordan together. Jordan is a keystone that's really kind of holding the dam back from extremism spreading even more further and destabilizing Israel and Egypt. And then you've really got to start marginalizing the Iranians. This administration made an enormous strategic blunder when they started to back off on the sanctions. They're not going to get a nuclear deal. They're not going to get a good nuclear deal, and they sacrificed the one thing that was really hurting the Iranians. And look at it from the Iranian perspective. They are now propping up Hezbollah. They are propping up Assad. They are back to propping up Hamas. They really can't afford or have the span of coverage to also back up radical Shias, pro-Iranian Shias in Iraq. They can't do this. And so letting them have cash is the last thing we should be doing now. If you do those four things, Kurdistan, the government, keep Jordan in the fight, marginalize Iran, you have a base to operating from. Think back to like World War II. Holding on to England wasn't going to win World War II, but we'd never have Normandy. We'd never invade Europe without it. Holding on to Pearl Harbor wasn't going to win the war in the Pacific, but if we didn't have Pearl Harbor, we'd never get back into the fight. We have to do these things. We have to do them now, because if we don't, we're not going to get back in the fight. But the problem is I haven't heard the president say that. I've heard the president say, what can I do to get this off the front page so I can quit being accused of doing nothing?
Well, I think that speaks, and by the way, it was a brilliant analysis. I think it's exactly why, even though his delivery was a bit mediocre, that when Clint Eastwood brought the empty chair scenario to the conversation, I think it resonated so much with people. And your point about stop losing is critical, and it starts with allies, as you pointed out. We've discussed a little over a year ago in the final say, we discussed with you what had concerned us at the time was the fact that you had a competitive rise in Turkey and Iran representing the Ottoman and Persian empires.
Right.
And we have seen that and we have fed into it. And it seems to me, Jim, that one of the areas that we have to really focus on in the quote-unquote stop losing game is we have to do a much better job of working with Egypt and Saudi Arabia, both of whom have pretty much been insulted and shooed by this president, because I think those are two places that are also linchpin states, but that they are two places that have the influence. They will work together. They seem to be quietly working with Israel. And I think with proper governance, they could actually become for moderation. It almost sounds crazy to say that about Saudi Arabia, but I think they push. I think their promotion of Wahhabism is backfiring enough where they're now afraid of the children that they raised.
Well, I think certainly Saudi Arabia is incredibly critical. They have problems of their own. You know, they're basically in a tit for tat battle with the Qataris. The Qataris essentially have kind of setting up their own foreign policy, and it's kind of showing a nice face to everybody and stabbing everybody in the back. Egypt's very, very important. You know, the president is completely, in a sense, disassociated and stuff. It was usually a huge mistake. You know, he just stepped forward really and kind of put Hamas in its place and really kind of brought a sense of potential to de-escalate the Gaza Israeli conflict, and of course, and you mentioned it, the other key country is Turkey, and Turkey's kind of a really interesting case study. I mean, Turkish foreign policy is almost as dysfunctional and dyslexic as U.S. foreign policy. It's almost like Erdogan and Obama have exchanged brains, because Turkey has a completely dysfunctional foreign policy. But to me, that's as troubling as the U.S. having a dysfunctional foreign policy. Turkey is an incredibly strategically important country because they are really a turning point between Western Europe and the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Super important. And, what the United States really has to be able to do, if we're going to, and we're not talking about taking it, we don't want the Middle East. We could care less. I mean, but if we want that part of the world to be constructive and stable and peaceful and prosperous, and which is what is actually in the U.S. best interest, we're going to need a series of countries that we can work with. They don't necessarily always have to work with each other, but they have to be able to work with us. And it really starts with Turkey. It goes through Iraq, but really Kurdistan is really the key to that. Goes to countries like Jordan and Israel, Egypt, and then it extends down into North Africa, because we often forget that North Africa and the Middle East are geographically very tied together, and goes into Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. If the United States had strong working relationships with those countries, we could have a very effective policy in the Middle East. But right now, these guys, we are just in shambles. This is far worse than it was under Carter in the 70s.
Absolutely, I agree wholeheartedly on Egypt. Where Egypt goes, so goes the caliphate potential, if you will. In other words, if Egypt is stable, you cannot build this North African through Iranian or Pakistan all the way to Pakistan caliphate, because it just won't happen. They're too big. They're too strong and prominent. Quick question regarding Turkey before I pass you back to Brett. It seems that with Erdogan winning the election, there is now, even though it was a small majority win, there is now a clear ongoing trajectory towards the tilt towards Islamism. Was it a mistake so soon after that election for the U.S. to clear a fairly significant high-tech missile sale to the Turkish military? As best I can tell, that didn't seem to come with the kind of appropriate strings attached to it. And of course, I raised this in the context of them really rabble-rousing and trying to spark another more Marva incident with Israel.
Turkey is the most fascinating country. I'm not really sure where it's going. The problem, I think I don't think we're done with the evolution of Turkey, and I'm not really sure what's going to happen. But their foreign policy is in such disarray. I'm not really sure Erdogan has the capacity to really drive the future of that country, and I'm not really sure what comes next. So it's kind of the thing. It's like you're watching a movie, and you can't really decide if you like the movie or not, and you're like, let's just go home. But it might get better. And so right now I'm like, I want to kind of see how the movie goes before I walk away.
That's a good point. Turkey is certainly the gateway to Europe and an influential state. And I'm not happy with some of the things that it's been publicly stating, or the support of Hamas in Gaza, or some of the statements towards Israel, or in some of these other situations. And I'd also add to this, when you look at Egypt, Jim, I think it's concerning that Egypt continues these discussions with Russia for the purchasing of weapons. And this is something that the administration has failed, because I think they feel like they have egg on their face over the Muslim Brotherhood thing and al-Sisi, taking back the power. But we have to get beyond that and understand how really vital the relationship is with Egypt, not just for our own reasons, but also for the fact that it's really the only country that has maintained a long-term peace with Israel. And as you mentioned earlier, to stabilize Jordan is to stabilize Israel and Egypt as well.
And, we're not done with Egypt yet either. I mean, that's a work in progress. Egypt still needs fundamental economic remorse to move forward. If all Sisi does is become another Mubarak, then we're going to be right back to another Arab Spring in a couple of years. And, and maybe next time we won't get rid of the Muslim Brotherhood. So his foreign policy, so Egypt and Turkey are, they're doppelgangers, right? Turkey has a good economy that's very productive and very positive, and a foreign policy that is just stupid. Egypt's demonstrated that they have a very responsible foreign policy. Their economy is still, mired in the Mubarak era. And what we want economic freedom and movement forward in Egypt, and we want the political balance, the civil society, and the sound foreign policy in Turkey, and then we'll be driving the train. But that doesn't happen with a president that is more worried about, to me the most telling thing was this thing with Hillary Clinton, that the president is more worried about what Hillary Clinton said about Syria than he is about Syria. So he's more worried about how people talk about him than he actually is about solving the nation's problems. We just saw that. We just saw this on the immigration debate. It's the most maddening thing I can imagine. He says, "Well, I have to act because Congress hasn't acted." Well, the president party controlled 2 houses of Congress for 2 years. They didn't act on immigration, and the president's policies have been absolutely divisive and have made the problem of finding a just and equitable solution worse. And then the president steps out and says, "Well, I have to act here." He's not creating the conditions to solve problems. He's creating the conditions to give himself the most comfortable politics, and that's not good for the country. And ironically, over the long term, it's not going to be good for his legacy. He will literally go down in history as the worst president of the modern era.
Absolutely, Jim. We're going to leave it with that. I want to thank you so much. We've had this ongoing relationship with you for so many years, you and Heritage, and having these discussions, and we thank you because you're one of the top guys out there on all these issues, and thank you. Folks, you can go find, first of all, his writings are on thedailysignal.com or heritage.org, and you can follow Jim on Twitter at JJ Carafano and at Carafano. Thanks again, Jim.